The star quarterback confessed to cheating and lost his scholarship until we found out the teacher forced him to sign it. The confession letter was posted on the main bulletin board outside the cafeteria on a Monday morning in early November. I saw it during the passing period between second and third period, surrounded by a crowd of students reading in stunned silence. The letter was typed on school letterhead and signed in what appeared to be Austin Reeves's handwriting. It stated that he, Austin Reeves, captain of the varsity football team and recipient of a full athletic scholarship to University of Michigan, had cheated on the midterm exam in AP Calculus by accessing the test questions beforehand through unauthorized means. He accepted full responsibility for his actions, acknowledged he had violated the school's academic integrity policy, and understood he would face appropriate consequences, including potential loss of his scholarship and suspension from the team. The letter was dated the previous Friday and had been signed by Austin, witnessed by his calculus teacher, Mr. Gregory Hamill, and countersigned by Principal Donnelly. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. Austin Reeves was my best friend since middle school, the guy who'd helped me through my parents' divorce freshman year, who'd never cheated on anything in his life, despite barely maintaining the grades needed to keep his scholarship active. I found Austin in the senior parking lot during lunch, sitting in his truck with the engine off, staring at nothing. He looked like he'd aged 5 years over the weekend. Dark circles under his eyes, shoulders slumped, the usual confidence that made him a natural leader on the field completely gone. I climbed into the passenger seat without asking and waited for him to acknowledge me. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and empty. I know what everyone's saying, that I'm a fraud, that I didn't deserve the scholarship, that coach should have known better than to trust me with captain. I told him I didn't believe he'd cheated, that the confession didn't make sense given everything I knew about his character. Austin laughed bitterly and said it didn't matter what I believed because he'd signed the confession himself. He'd admitted it in writing with witnesses present. Michigan had already revoked his scholarship. Coach Brennan had suspended him from the team indefinitely. His future was destroyed regardless of what actually happened. I asked him directly if he'd cheated on the calculus exam. Austin turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. Fear. Not guilt or shame, but genuine terror barely suppressed. I signed the confession, he said carefully. That's all that matters now. Just let it go, okay? Don't get involved. The warning in his voice was clear. He wasn't denying the cheating so much as refusing to discuss it, and his insistence that I stay out of it suggested there was more to the story than a simple academic integrity violation. I pressed harder, asking what had happened Friday when he signed the letter. Austin's jaw tightened, and he gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. Hamill caught me with the test questions. I had them in my bag. He reported it to Donnelly, and they gave me a choice. Sign the confession and accept punishment, or they'd report it to the police as theft of school property, and I'd face criminal charges. I signed. The explanation was too rehearsed, too mechanical. Austin was a terrible liar, always had been, and this story sounded like something he'd memorized rather than lived. That afternoon, I went to the main office and requested to see Principal Donnelly. His secretary said he was unavailable, but I could make an appointment for later in the week. I explained I needed to discuss Austin Reeves' situation, and she repeated that Donnelly was unavailable, her tone making clear that the topic was closed for discussion. I left the office and went to find Mr. Hamill instead. His classroom was in the science wing, a corner room with windows overlooking the practice fields where the football team was running drills without their captain. Hamill was at his desk grading papers when I knocked on his open door. He was in his mid-40s, tall and thin with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of teacher who prided himself on academic rigor and high standards. He'd been at Riverside Academy for 12 years and had a reputation for being strict, but fair. When he saw me, his expression shifted from neutral to guarded. "If you're here about Austin Reeves, I can't discuss student disciplinary matters," he said before I could speak. "That's confidential." I told him I wasn't asking for confidential information, just trying to understand what had happened. Hamill removed his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth from his desk drawer, not making eye contact. Austin was caught with unauthorized test materials. He admitted to cheating. He signed a confession. That's all there is to understand. The formality of his response felt wrong, too careful and lawyered. I asked how exactly Austin had been caught, what the circumstances were. Hamill put his glasses back on and looked at me directly for the first time. I found the test questions in his backpack during a random bag check I conducted before the exam. The questions were printed on paper that matched documents from my personal files. When confronted, Austin admitted he'd taken them from my desk. The evidence was conclusive. I asked if there had been witnesses to this bag check or the confrontation. Hamill's expression hardened. "The integrity of my classroom and my word as an educator should be sufficient. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." He turned back to his papers in obvious dismissal, but I'd seen something in his face when I'd asked about witnesses. Defensiveness that went beyond protecting a student's privacy. I spent the rest of the week investigating quietly, talking to other students in Austin's calculus class, and trying to piece together what had actually happened. The story I heard from multiple sources was consistent, but raised more questions than it answered. No one had witnessed the bag check or confrontation between Austin and Hamill. On the Friday before the confession letter appeared, Austin had been called to Hamill's classroom after school. He'd emerged an hour later looking shaken and had left campus immediately without talking to anyone. The following Monday, the confession letter had been posted. None of Austin's teammates or friends believed he'd actually cheated because his grade in calculus had been a legitimate B- all semester. He'd been working with a tutor, attending study sessions, and doing all his homework. The idea that he'd suddenly resort to stealing test questions didn't match his pattern of effort or his character. Several people mentioned that Hamill had seemed to have it out for Austin all year, making comments about student-athletes getting special treatment and questioning whether Austin's grades were really his own work. My girlfriend Olivia, who was editor of the school newspaper, had access to student records through her position on the Journalism Advisory Committee. She pulled Austin's complete transcript and academic history, and what we found was revealing. Austin's grades across all subjects had been consistently average to above average throughout high school. He'd never been accused of academic dishonesty before. His calculus grade had been trending upward throughout the semester, from C+ in September to B- in October. The midterm he'd allegedly cheated on had been taken the week before he was caught with the questions, which meant he'd already completed the test when Hamill claimed to have found the materials in his bag. That timeline made no sense. Why would Austin have printed test questions after he'd already taken the exam? I pointed this out to Olivia, and she immediately saw the same logical inconsistency I had. Either Hamill had confused the timeline, or something else was going on that didn't match the official story. We decided to check the school's security camera footage. Riverside Academy had cameras throughout the building, including in hallways outside classrooms. If Austin had been called to Hamill's room after school on that Friday, there would be video evidence of when he arrived and left, possibly showing his emotional state. Olivia had legitimate access to request footage for newspaper investigations, so she filed a formal request with the school's security coordinator, Mr. Dennis Kowalski. The request was denied within 2 hours with a note saying that footage related to ongoing disciplinary matters was restricted to administrative personnel only. The speed of the denial and the specificity of the reasoning suggested someone had been anticipating requests for that particular footage and had prepared a justification to block access. Olivia filed an appeal arguing that journalism had a right to investigate matters of public interest within the school, but was told the appeal would take 3 to 4 weeks to process. By then, any relevant footage would be automatically deleted as part of the system's 30-day retention policy. I decided to talk to Austin's parents, hoping they might have information about what had happened that Friday. Mr. and Mrs. Reeves lived in a modest house in the older part of town. The kind of neighborhood where working families raised kids on tight budgets and football scholarships represented escape from economic constraints. Austin's father worked at the auto plant outside town. His mother was a nurse at the county hospital. They'd pinned all their hopes on Austin's athletic ability, translating into a college education they couldn't otherwise afford. When I arrived at their house on a Saturday afternoon, Mrs. Reeves answered the door looking exhausted and heartbroken. She invited me in and offered coffee I didn't want, but accepted to be polite. Mr. Reeves was in the living room watching a college game with the volume low, and he barely acknowledged my presence. The atmosphere was heavy with disappointment and defeat. Mrs. Reeves explained that Austin had come home that Friday evening devastated and refusing to discuss what had happened. He'd locked himself in his room all weekend and had only emerged Monday morning to go to school. When they'd seen the confession letter, they'd confronted him, and he'd insisted he'd cheated and deserved the punishment. But Mrs. Reeves said she'd known her son for 18 years and could tell when he was lying. He was terrified, she said quietly. Not guilty, terrified. When we asked him about details, he couldn't provide any. He just kept repeating that he'd done it and we needed to accept his punishment. I asked if they'd considered hiring a lawyer to challenge the confession. Mr. Reeves spoke for the first time, his voice bitter. With what money? We're barely making mortgage payments. Austin's scholarship was supposed to solve our financial problems, not create new ones. And even if we could afford a lawyer, what would we argue? He signed a confession. Schools have broad authority over disciplinary matters. We'd be fighting the entire institution with no resources and no proof of anything except our son's signature on a piece of paper admitting guilt. The helplessness in their voices made me angry. Austin was being railroaded by some process that didn't make sense, and his family was too economically vulnerable to fight back. The system was designed to protect itself, not students, especially students without money or power. I left the Reeves house determined to find proof of what had actually happened that Friday. If Austin wouldn't or couldn't tell the truth, I'd have to uncover it myself. I started by researching academic integrity procedures in the school handbook. According to official policy, any student accused of cheating had the right to a hearing before a faculty committee, the right to present evidence in their defense, and the right to have a parent or guardian present during any disciplinary proceedings. Austin had been denied all those rights. He'd been confronted alone, pressured into signing a confession, and punished without due process. The violation of procedure was clear, but proving it would require demonstrating that Austin had been coerced rather than confessing voluntarily. I needed to understand more about Mr. Hamill and whether he had any motive for framing Austin. I went to the school library and searched through old yearbooks and newspaper archives for information about Hamill's history at Riverside Academy. What I found was interesting. Hamill had been hired 12 years ago as a math teacher after working at a private school in another state. In his third year at Riverside, he'd been passed over for department chair in favor of a younger teacher named Ms. Rebecca Wu. The following year, Ms. Wu had been accused of inflating grades for student athletes to keep them eligible for competition. An investigation had cleared her of wrongdoing, but the accusation had damaged her reputation, and she'd left Riverside for another position. Hamill had been named interim department chair and had eventually been made permanent chair. The pattern suggested Hamill was willing to use accusations of academic dishonesty to eliminate competition, or people he viewed as threats to his authority or principles. I shared this information with Olivia, and she dug deeper into Hamill's background using newspaper databases and public records. She discovered something explosive. 10 years ago, when Hamill had been teaching at the private school before Riverside, there had been a scandal involving falsified academic records. Several students had been expelled for cheating on advanced placement exams, and their college acceptances had been revoked. 2 years later, an investigation by the state education department had revealed that the evidence against those students had been fabricated by a teacher who had been stealing money from the school's testing budget and needed to create a crisis to cover up his embezzlement. That teacher had been Gregory Hamill. He'd resigned before formal charges could be filed, and the matter had been settled quietly with the agreement that he'd never teach in that state again. He'd moved to our state and been hired at Riverside Academy with no mention of the scandal in his employment records. The private school had provided a neutral reference as part of the settlement, and Riverside had never known they were hiring someone who'd destroyed students' lives to cover his own crimes. This changed everything. Hamill had a documented history of framing students for academic dishonesty. If he was doing the same thing to Austin, we needed to figure out what he was covering up or what he stood to gain from destroying Austin's future. Olivia and I spent the next week investigating Hamill's activities and looking for any irregularities that might explain his actions. We discovered that Hamill was the faculty sponsor for Academic League, the school's competitive quiz bowl team. He was also responsible for administering all advanced placement exams and maintaining the security of testing materials. Those responsibilities gave him access to confidential student information and significant authority over academic matters. If he was abusing that authority, the victims would be vulnerable students who couldn't easily fight back. Then we found something that made the entire situation clear. Olivia obtained a copy of the school's budget allocation for academic programs through a public records request her newspaper advisor had filed months earlier for an unrelated article. Buried in the line items was a discretionary fund of $15,000 allocated to the math department chair for purchasing supplementary materials, funding competition travel, and supporting student academic enrichment. The fund required minimal oversight, and receipts were only audited annually by the school board. Hamill, as department chair, had sole authority over how that money was spent. Olivia compared the budget allocation to actual expenditures and found significant discrepancies. Over the past 3 years, Hamill had reported spending the full $15,000 annually, but when she cross-referenced his reported purchases with actual invoices filed with the main office, only about $8,000 per year could be accounted for. The remaining $7,000 annually had been reported as spent, but had no corresponding documentation. Over 3 years, Hamill had potentially embezzled more than $20,000 from school funds. We needed proof that Hamill was stealing, and that Austin's confession was related to covering up that theft. I remembered that Austin had been a member of Academic League his junior year, which meant he'd traveled with the team to competitions that would have been funded through Hamill's discretionary account. If Austin had noticed something suspicious about how that money was being handled, or had seen documentation that didn't match Hamill's reports, he might have become a threat that needed to be neutralized. I tracked down 2 other former Academic League members and asked if they'd noticed anything unusual about team finances or Hamill's handling of money during competitions. Both confirmed that Hamill had been secretive about budgets and had often claimed there wasn't money for things the team needed, even though the budget allocation was supposed to be generous. One student mentioned that Hamill had insisted on paying for all team expenses personally and then seeking reimbursement later, which prevented students from seeing actual costs or receipts. I went back to Austin and confronted him directly about what he'd seen or known about Hamill's financial activities. At first he refused to talk, repeating that he'd cheated and deserved his punishment. But when I told him we'd found evidence of embezzlement and believed Hamill had framed him to keep him quiet, Austin finally broke down. He admitted that the previous spring, he'd been in Hamill's classroom helping set up for an Academic League practice when he'd accidentally knocked over a filing cabinet. Papers had spilled out, including receipts and budget documents. Austin had helped pick them up and had noticed that one receipt for a hotel stay during a competition claimed the team had needed 12 rooms at $150 per room, totaling $1,800. But Austin remembered that competition clearly because only 8 students and 2 parent chaperones had traveled, meaning they'd needed at most 6 rooms. He'd mentioned the discrepancy to Hamill, thinking it was an honest mistake. Hamill had become defensive and angry, insisting that Austin had misunderstood what he'd seen and needed to forget about it. Austin had let it go at the time, but the interaction had bothered him. A few weeks later, he'd been called to help inventory academic materials in the storage room where testing supplies were kept. He'd noticed several boxes of AP exam materials that were supposed to have been returned to College Board after testing, but were still in storage. The boxes had been opened and materials were missing. He'd mentioned this to Hamill as well, again thinking it was something that needed to be corrected. Hamill had insisted the boxes were from a previous year and would be dealt with appropriately. But Austin had checked the labels, and they were from the current year. He'd started wondering if Hamill was selling AP exam materials, which would be a serious crime involving federal testing security violations. He hadn't reported his concerns because he had no proof and was afraid of accusing a teacher without evidence. Then, the Friday before the confession letter appeared, Hamill had called Austin to his classroom after school and confronted him with a bag containing printed test questions from the upcoming calculus midterm. Hamill had claimed he'd found the bag in Austin's locker during a random inspection authorized by administration. He'd said the evidence proved Austin had been planning to cheat and that he was reporting it to Principal Donnelly immediately. Austin had denied everything, insisting he'd never seen those materials before and had no idea how they'd gotten into his locker. Hamill had then changed tactics, becoming almost friendly. He'd said that he understood athletes faced tremendous pressure to maintain grades and that he was willing to give Austin a chance to avoid criminal charges if Austin was willing to cooperate. He'd produced the confession letter already typed and printed and explained that Austin had two options: sign the confession, accept academic punishment, and lose his scholarship, but avoid criminal prosecution for theft of school property, or refuse to sign and face charges that would result in a criminal record and jail time. Hamill had given Austin 15 minutes to decide while he stepped out of the classroom to make copies. Alone and terrified, Austin had signed. The coercion was clear, but we still needed proof that Hamill had planted the test questions in Austin's locker and that the entire accusation was fabricated to silence Austin's knowledge of the embezzlement and testing fraud. I asked Austin if anyone had witnessed Hamill accessing his locker or if there was any way to prove the bag hadn't been there before that Friday. Austin said his locker partner, a junior named Kyle Brennan, who was the coach's nephew, had been with him that morning and the locker had been empty except for their normal books and supplies. Kyle would be able to testify that there had been no bag of test materials at the start of the day. I found Kyle in the weight room after school and explained what we were investigating. He confirmed that he and Austin had been at the locker together that morning and there had been no unfamiliar bags or materials. He agreed to provide a written statement if needed. Now we had a witness proving the materials hadn't been in the locker in the morning, which meant they'd been planted later. The next question was how Hamill had accessed Austin's locker. School lockers used combination locks assigned by the administration, and only the student and the main office were supposed to have access to the combinations. But teachers, particularly department chairs, had master access to student records, including locker assignments and combinations for emergency purposes. Hamill could have easily obtained Austin's combination and planted the evidence without leaving any trace. The security cameras would have footage of the hallway where Austin's locker was located, which would show Hamill accessing it if we could get that footage before it was deleted. The problem was that our request had been denied and we had no legitimate way to access the recordings. Olivia suggested we talk to Dennis Kowalski, the security coordinator, directly rather than going through official channels. Kowalski had been at Riverside for 25 years, first as a teacher and then as security coordinator after a back injury ended his coaching career. He had a reputation for caring more about students than politics. We found him in his office Monday afternoon and explained what we'd discovered about Hamill's embezzlement and Austin's coerced confession. Kowalski listened carefully without interrupting, and when we finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at us with an expression that was hard to read. "I wondered if someone would figure it out," he said finally. "I pulled that footage the day after Austin's confession was posted, because something felt wrong about the whole situation. I watched Hamill access Austin's locker on that Friday morning during second period when students were in class. He was carrying a bag that he didn't have when he entered the hallway. He opened the locker, placed the bag inside, locked it again, and left. The whole thing took maybe 40 seconds. I asked why he hadn't reported what he'd seen to administration or the school board. Kowalski's expression turned bitter. I tried. I took the footage to Donnelly and explained what it showed. Donnelly told me I was mistaken about what I'd seen, that Hamill had legitimate reasons for accessing student lockers as department chair, and that creating conspiracy theories about respected faculty members could be grounds for termination. He ordered me to delete the footage and not discuss it with anyone. I asked if he'd deleted it. Kowalski smiled grimly. I'm supposed to follow the 30-day retention policy, but sometimes files get backed up to external drives before deletion for security purposes. Those backup files aren't subject to the official deletion schedule. He pulled a flash drive from his desk drawer and handed it to me. This is a copy of the hallway footage from that Friday morning showing Hamill planting evidence in Austin's locker. I'm giving it to you because I'm retiring at the end of this year, and I'm tired of watching administrators protect their own at the expense of students. Use it to get that boy his scholarship back. We had everything we needed: evidence of embezzlement, witness testimony about coercion, proof that the test materials had been planted, and video footage showing Hamill committing the frame-up. The question now was who to present this information to in a way that would result in action rather than cover-up. Principal Donnelly had already demonstrated he was protecting Hamill, which meant going through school administration would be futile. Olivia suggested we take everything directly to the school board and to law enforcement simultaneously, making it impossible for anyone to suppress the information without coordinating across multiple institutions. We spent 3 days compiling a comprehensive case file that included all our evidence, witness statements, financial documentation, and the video footage. The file was organized like a legal brief, laying out the timeline of events, the evidence of crimes, and the chain of coercion that had resulted in Austin's false confession. On a Thursday afternoon in late November, exactly 3 weeks after Austin's confession letter had been posted, we presented our case file to the school board president Angela Morrison during her office hours at the district administration building. Morrison was a lawyer who'd been elected to the board 2 years earlier on a platform of transparency and accountability. She had 3 children in district schools and had a reputation for taking student advocacy seriously. We spent 90 minutes walking her through every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every connection between Hamill's financial crimes and Austin's forced confession. Morrison watched the security footage 3 times, her expression growing darker with each viewing. When we finished, she made 2 phone calls. The first was to the district attorney's office requesting an immediate investigation into embezzlement and evidence tampering. The second was to the state education department reporting potential federal testing security violations involving AP materials. The investigation moved quickly once it had official momentum. The district attorney assigned a prosecutor named David Wu, who specialized in white-collar crime and public corruption. He subpoenaed all of Hamill's financial records related to the math department discretionary fund and obtained warrants to search Hamill's classroom and home for evidence of stolen testing materials. The search of his home office revealed dozens of unopened AP exam booklets from multiple years and subjects, representing thousands of dollars in stolen materials that Hamill had apparently been planning to sell to college prep companies or individual students. The financial audit revealed that Hamill had been systematically inflating expense reports and pocketing the difference for more than 5 years, stealing approximately $35,000 total from school funds. He'd used the money to pay off gambling debts and fund a lifestyle beyond his teaching salary. When confronted with the evidence, Hamill attempted to claim that Austin had been helping him steal the testing materials and had threatened to expose him, necessitating the confession as a form of self-defense. That explanation collapsed immediately when prosecutors presented the security footage showing Hamill planting evidence, Kyle's testimony about the locker being empty that morning, and Austin's statement about being coerced into signing the confession under threat of criminal prosecution. Wu also brought charges against Principal Donnelly for obstruction of justice and conspiracy after Kowalski testified about being ordered to delete footage and threatened with termination for investigating Hamill's actions. The scandal exploded across local and state media. News outlets ran stories about the teacher who'd framed his star athlete to cover up embezzlement and the principal who'd protected him. The school board held emergency meetings and issued public apologies to Austin and his family. Board members who'd been present during previous budget reviews where Hamill's irregularities should have been caught faced intense criticism for failing in their oversight responsibilities. Austin's confession was immediately invalidated by the board, and his record was cleared of all references to academic dishonesty. University of Michigan was contacted and provided with the evidence proving Austin had been framed. The university not only reinstated his scholarship, but issued a formal apology and offered additional academic support to help him overcome the disruption to his senior year. Coach Brennan reinstated Austin as team captain, and the team rallied around him for the final games of the season. Austin's story became a rallying point for discussions about due process in school discipline and the vulnerability of students to adult authority figures who abuse their power. Several other students came forward with complaints about Hamill's behavior over the years, describing incidents where he'd made inappropriate accusations or used his authority to intimidate students who questioned him. Hamill was arrested and charged with embezzlement, evidence tampering, coercion, theft of federal testing materials, and multiple counts of official misconduct. He pled guilty to avoid trial and was sentenced to 6 years in prison, plus restitution of all stolen funds and fines totaling more than $100,000. His teaching license was permanently revoked, and he was barred from ever working in education again. Principal Donnelly was charged with obstruction and conspiracy. He pled guilty to reduced charges and received 2 years probation, plus termination of his employment and permanent ban from administrative positions in education. The school board hired an independent investigation firm to review all disciplinary actions taken by Donnelly and Hamill over the previous 5 years to identify other potential cases of abuse or misconduct. That review found 3 additional students who'd been punished based on questionable evidence or problematic procedures. All 3 had their records corrected and received formal apologies. The civil lawsuit that Austin's family filed against the school district, Hamill and Donnelly, was settled for $850,000, which covered legal fees, compensatory damages for the emotional distress and reputational harm Austin suffered, and punitive damages reflecting the egregiousness of the defendant's conduct. The settlement also required the district to implement new safeguards for student discipline, including mandatory legal counsel for any student facing expulsion or serious academic sanctions, video recording of all disciplinary meetings, and independent oversight of department discretionary funds. Angela Morrison led the charge for these reforms, arguing that what happened to Austin revealed systematic failures that needed to be addressed through policy changes, not just individual punishment. The reforms were adopted unanimously and became a model for other districts grappling with similar issues of administrative accountability and student rights. Austin graduated as class salutatorian with a 3.8 GPA and led the football team to the state championship game his senior year. His recruitment story became legendary in college football circles, and Michigan's coaching staff used his perseverance through false accusations as an example of character and resilience. He majored in criminal justice, planning to become a prosecutor who specialized in defending people falsely accused of crimes. Olivia won a National Journalism Award for her investigative reporting on the case and went to Northwestern to study investigative journalism. Kyle Brennan became a vocal advocate for student rights and worked with the state legislature on education reform bills. Dennis Kowalski retired at the end of the year as planned, but stayed involved as an advisor to the school board on security and student safety issues, his actions in preserving evidence and standing up to administrative pressure earning him widespread respect. I learned that courage isn't always dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's just refusing to accept convenient explanations when the evidence doesn't make sense, asking questions when everyone else has moved on, and doing the tedious work of documenting and investigating until truth becomes undeniable. Austin had been powerless against Hamill's authority and Donnelly's protection of institutional reputation, but a group of students with determination and a security coordinator with integrity had been enough to expose corruption and force accountability. The system had failed Austin catastrophically, but people within that system had chosen to fight for him rather than accepting injustice as inevitable. 2 years later, standing in Michigan Stadium watching Austin lead his team onto the field for his first college game, I thought about how close we'd come to letting a good person's future be destroyed by a corrupt teacher's desperation to protect his crimes. The scholarship he'd almost lost had been saved not by authority figures doing their jobs, but by friends refusing to abandon him when everyone else already had. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.